Welcome to another live inside the Radiantly Live Woman. I'm really happy to have you here joining me for this session where we're going to dive into an interesting topic. I've had this question a lot. I have thought about it a lot in my own practice working with others. We're going to talk about bone breaks today. Not just bone breaks, but how they are scars and how we can start working them. We want to know the real importance behind a bone break, what's actually going on, and how can we work with them more effectively. Because really, we don't actually work with them at all. We hurt ourselves, we get the imaging that confirms the break, then we get a cast on, some sort of plaster, sling, whatever it needs to be, boot, all of those things. And then we wait a certain amount of time for the bone to heal. We get the confirmation that the bone has healed, or we've waited X amount of time, so we assume that the bone is healed. And then we get the device off, the cast or the boot or the whatever off, and then we just go about our day. And there needs to be a lot more thinking involved. There needs to be a lot more integration, and we can do a little bit better with bone breaks, particularly the ones where the bone is completely severed, like there is a complete full break. I'm not necessarily talking so much about the bone breaks where there is just a tiny little fracture. Those are less significant. However, how I'm going to speak about bones today may give you some insight about maybe you have a bone break that just doesn't really heal. It's just constantly sore. It doesn't get the input that it needs to fully heal and resolve. So I'm going to give you a method on how to work with that as well. So in these videos, as we always do, we go through 3 sections. We go into the physical considerations, the energy and the emotion, as well as the what to do with this particular scar. So let's just dive right in and get clear on bone breaks. Are they a scar? Are they not? How can we work them? How can we work smarter, think better, and really help ourselves along our transformation journey? So let's talk about what bone breaks I'm talking about or referring to specifically. So I'm not talking about, like I said, small little fracture sites. Those are less impactful and less on your radar. However, if you have a bone break, like a fracture, just like a splintering that is not healing, please watch this video because there's going to be information for you about what to do. I'm mostly referring to breaks that have fully broken, like the bone all the way through. So if you break your wrist, for example, you're breaking your radius and your ulna. If you've broken your ankle bone, you've broken your fibula, all of these things, you've broken the humerus fully, femur fully, whatever vertebrae, all of that. I want you to really think and listen about all the things to consider with bone breaks because they're really significant and we haven't really thought about them. We have this kind of conditioning where you get the cast off and then you're good to go. And like I said at the beginning of this video, we want to work better. So these are the scars that I'm referring to. Now, how are they scars? Like, what am I actually talking about? Once a bone heals, it's just healed. It's totally fine, right? Well, if you've had one of these breaks where it's fully through the bone, or you know someone, or maybe your kid has a break like this, you'll know that in general, there'll be a little bump, or there'll be a dent, or there'll be some change in shape in the bone configuration. And what I want to talk about is there's a few important mechanisms that we want to discuss and make sense of in relation to scars. So how I talk about scars is a webbing. Like usually we're talking about it's happened on the skin layer and it's a webbing or like it's this dense kind of wad of gum-like thing that's looking for anchoring onto bone. Now we're talking about the bone itself. And what bones do, actually not just bones, many different organs in our body will do this over, I'm just going to call it something super simple. I'm sure it has a fancy name, but there's an overdoing mechanism in the body. Something overproduces. So if you sprain an ankle, for example, your body will overproduce swelling and inflammation. As soon as that event happens that causes pain and distress to the area, the body will rush a bunch of stuff, healing stuff, in with the swelling, in with the inflammation to start working on the area right away. But it's an overdoing mechanism. So, forever we've been saying, put ice on stuff, put ice on stuff. because we want to control that overdoing mechanism. We want to tame and tone that down. However, one of the main people who kind of brought that to the world, this RICE idea, which is rest, ice, compress, and elevate, the man who kind of brought that forward has actually gone back on his thinking and said, actually, maybe we shouldn't be icing so much. Maybe we should be applying heat. Maybe we should just be doing compression and not the ice part. So there's been this whole cryotherapy, heat therapy thing going on, forever when we have these kind of acute injuries. So there's this overdoing mechanism that I'm talking about with the ankle sprain. There's the same overdoing mechanism when we have tendonitis. So when we have a constant rubbing, like over friction in the area, the body will overproduce swelling, inflammation. It will also like thicken the tendon. So you'll have a tendon thickening. Sometimes it damages the way that you can move your fingers, for example, because the tendon becomes so thick that it can't move properly through specific types of sheaths and all these other different examples. When you have a tendon thickening, it's becoming less adaptable and more fibrotic. It's an overdoing mechanism. Now, if we talk about bones, back into the land of bone breaks, what happens is when you break a bone, let's just take, just for the visual, let's go back to the splintering, just to the slight fracture, because it's just easy for our minds to see and understand. So if we just have, so I fractured my collarbone. I didn't break it all the way through, I just fractured it. So when that happens, it's like a splintering effect in the bone. It damages the bone. It's like a tree branch. You didn't snap it all the way, but it got disturbed. That's not in its full kind of ingrained capacity anymore. Now, what the bones will do, like the bone functions, there's osteoblasts and osteoclasts, to get super geeky, is they will take more bone than needed. They'll remove more bone than required than just that little fracture. Imagine it like the osteoclasts are like literally like chomping away at bone, even bone that's totally healthy, to make room for new bone that will grow in the place. So in my mind, I'm visualizing these parts of the bone going to work almost like an ice cream scoop, like clearing debris away, clearing stuff away. So it's making room, it's clearing away all of the bone that's damaged, as well as any neighboring bone. Because when that groove gets open fully, like a big old scoop in the ice cream container. Like if you go get ice cream at a store, they have these massive like vats of ice cream. Once that's happened inside the bone, it will start filling with new matrix of bone. So it's fresh, it's new. Osteoblasts go in and fill that. So why is this important? Because it's an overdoing mechanism. It's the same overdoing mechanism. It will overproduce, so it'll over pull out and it will over put in. So sometimes what happens when you have full breaks in particular, there'll be bumps and grooves and usually like little mounds of excess bone because of this overdoing mechanism. And this is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about scars. So if you have seen my SCAR course, Scars Matter, which is up on my website for $27, it's got jam-packed tons of info that you should check out if you're interested about scars. What I'm talking about in that video is something super important that I want you to kind of understand. So when we're talking about the scars, I want you to think about scars as being this dense capacity, and it's like taking up room and space. So the body doesn't have a lot of like extra wiggle room for stuff. It's not like you can just pack, a little bit of extra bone in there, or like a tumor or a baby. There's not a lot of extra space. Sometimes it can be accommodating for like something like a fetus, but in general, a thickening of a tendon, extra inflammation, thickening of a bone, we don't have the room for that so much. We don't have the room for bowels that are constantly full if we're suffering from constipation. All of these things start to impact the body. So what we need to do is we need to think about the bone scar like that. We want to clear as much of that away. Now you're probably thinking, how could we do that? How does that happen? How can we do that if the bone break is so old? What I want you to think about is the way that bones heal is by input. Actually, like the way most of the body works is through putting in stimulus and giving it input. So when people are having these fractures, these small like hairline things going on that aren't healing, is because we're actually not putting the correct amount of input into the area. I don't mean like banging on the hairline fracture and irritating it, but somewhere we're not putting in the correct input or we don't have the resources to fully heal. That's another common thing. So, for example, people who are smokers or people who are older generally heal from bone breaks longer. It takes them a longer amount of time because people who are older just have less resources because of their age. People who are smokers have less resources because their body is strained. But it's not just smokers, it's people in general now, as we're drained and depleted as kind of like a whole. With the way that we live our lives, the way our environment is set up is we're kind of in a state of depletion. So I really want you to think about that as a method, which we'll talk about more in the future, coming up in this video. So that's how I want you to start thinking about the scar, why it's important. We talked about the overdoing mechanism. Now I want to just briefly talk about the importance of integrating it back. You need some sort of setup, some sort of movement structured plan to integrate that bone break back into the rest of your body. So there's this really cool experiment that they did where you have 5 fingers, you know how to use all 5 of your fingers. Unconsciously, you're doing stuff with it all the time. They did this experiment where they just taped the 2 fingers, I can't remember which ones they were, but they taped 2 fingers together, so you only were functioning with like 4 fingers. And you had to kind of modify the way that you were moving, obviously. You can't pick up stuff the same. You got to, put on your shirt differently, brush your hair differently. All of these different things had to change. And eventually you just kind of got the hang of it. You just kind of got the knack for it because you just went to work with what you have. And they found that in the brain, they actually started like just graying over the area where there was 5 fingers present in like the brain map. There was only 4. So that's how quickly the body can kind of forget. I'm doing this because it's not really forgetting, but this is how quickly the body can forget an area. If you don't have an awareness of a part of your body, it's kind of like a void, like a black hole in your periphery. You can't connect with it. You don't really know how to move it. You don't really engage with it. You don't put any input in there. And so it starts to black over in your awareness, but it's not just in your awareness, it's actually in your neurology. So when we have a bone break, when we get our cast off and it's been like locked down for 6, 8, 10, maybe even 12 weeks, however, depending on the bone, we need to bring it back and integrate it with ourselves. We need to have a practice that brings it back. And most of us don't get taught that, and we don't do that. Over time, you'll see this with people's history. You'll hear it in their timeline. Places where they have bone breaks, they also have other problems. They have tendonitis, they have other joint stuff going on. And we want to think about this really, really clearly in our mind as an action plan to move forward. So I want you to really think about the importance of integrating back. Now, let's talk about the 3 sections that I always reference inside these videos. Let's talk about the physical first. So I just kind of set the landscape up for understanding why those things are important. Now let's talk about the physical considerations. So mostly in these videos that I've been doing, we're talking about a particular scar. So I can get like really focused in on physical considerations because we're talking about a thyroid scar, for example, or a breast implant scar, for example, which I did earlier this week. But now we're talking about bone breaks that could be all over the body. We're talking about fingers, toes, limbs, vertebrae, head, skull, jaw. We're talking about a lot of stuff. So I'm going to talk as generally as I can and see yourself in these explanations. So when you have a scar that's on the bone, I want to talk about 4 different areas, which are the fluid systems. I call them the fluid systems because it's easier for me to talk about. It really is just the lumping of the lymphatic system as well as the circulatory system. So think about those 2 together when I say fluids. I also want you to think about the joint integrity, meaning like how well the joint is resting on top of each other, how well one is sitting on the other, and is it centered or not? Usually when there's a bone break, that's not happening. Usually there's some sort of misalignment depending on where the break is and all sorts of other factors. Like if it was a growth plate break, if it was in the center of the bone, every bone has like its weakest point. So the collarbone, for example, is more likely to break on like the distal, like the end third, but every bone has its like weak spot. So we want to talk about the joint integrity of the area. We also want to talk about tension. We want to talk about tension of the whole kind of musculoskeletal system, which comprises of all your muscles, your tendons, your ligaments, as well as your fascia, and of course, your bones. And then an interesting thing that is kind of widespread that I'll just briefly touch on is pressure. Most people who have bad bone breaks can tell the pressure changes or they get pain in the joint or pain in the break when the weather changes, when the weather's up and down, right before it's about to storm, or if it's going to snow, or if it gets really windy. People will comment on this and they'll like get that like sense from the bone break. So first, let's talk about the fluid systems. Super simple. When there's stuff in the way that shouldn't be there, meaning everything should have a nice amount of room to slide and glide on top of each other, there's not a lot of wiggle room. There's not a lot of extra room to have a big, scar on top of a bone there. When it is, it impacts the way in which the fluids move in and out of the area. How the fluids get into the area and how the fluids exit the area is equally important because we want to make sure that the correct nourishment is sliding and passing through as well as nourishing the area. But we also want to make sure that toxins, debris, and just stuff that needs to be recycled is easily moved out and away. And that's sometimes impacted when you have a big bump like scar on the bone. So think about that as it relates to you. You may feel like there's some stagnation, some type of stuckness. You may feel heavy. You may feel like challenged in your immune system in some ways. All of these different kind of symptoms will come when you have a fluid challenge. Now, the next thing, joint integrity. Joint integrity, these are like somewhat of I usually don't use bigger words, but this is probably one of the bigger words that I am using. You want to think about the centration of your joint, meaning like, is the joint centered? A lot of the time, when you break your bone fully, the bone is not 100%, like it's not aligned 100%. And depending on where your bone break is, it may challenge the alignment of the joint, not just the joint above the break, but the joint below. So then we're talking about, a bone break quickly goes into like, for example, if you break your lower leg. So you break your lower leg, all of a sudden you have an ankle problem as well as a knee problem because that bone is the thing that articulates and makes a knee and makes an ankle joint. And then we quickly can just jump up into the hip and into the foot. So people who have breaks in their lower limb, for example, will also usually have a lot of joint stuff going on that same side. So something to look at as well. Another thing, tension. So I just mentioned tension. I'm talking about everything related to the musculoskeletal system, muscles, tendons, ligaments, fascia, all that connective tissue, as well as the bone. There's going to be tension, and we need to have tension in our body. Actually, our body functions, or the muscles function in our body just like elastics. So there's like a positive tension that we need. But with bone breaks, it can create a tension that just doesn't quit. Meaning not just like, oh, I'm not very flexible, this sucks. I mean, like it's creating a misalignment in the tension relationships around the joint. So if a joint is like fully centered, that means that like all the stuff in the area is sitting in its ideal place. It's not too tight, it's not like pulled and really taut, and it's not slack and really loose. And when that is not happening, there's areas where there's going to be tons of tightness and areas that are super slack And that puts a challenge on the whole musculoskeletal system, as well, like I said, is the joints, as well as the fluids. You can start to see how this all kind of, it's the same dance. It's the same conversation. I'm just weaving in and out of different systems, but really everything's connected. One needs to be spoken about, and then the other, and then the other. It's kind of a knock-on effect. And where you have your bone break will depend on how much of one is really being affected, as well as other things. Talking about the function of your spine. If you have a bone break on your spine, that will greatly impact not just your spine health, but also all of your organs, as well as your breathing mechanisms, and so on and so forth. So the last thing that I want to talk about in the physical is pressure. People will feel there's a problem or like a third sense. They have like a feeling in their body when pressure changes in the body. Pressure changes in the environment, like the weather changes, the weather patterns are on the move. Now, a lot of this has something to do with the healing of the bones, as well as a kind of dysfunction to different types of vibration. They're feeling the pressure and the vibratory change in the environment, and they're feeling that in their body. So there are ways to relieve and resolve that. Some people like it, but some people find it really annoying. So there are ways to kind of work with that, and that will come in with the what to do at the end of this. Now, the energetic and the emotional considerations is something that's really important. And here, when we're talking about bone breaks, we're talking about so much. I can't be as specific as you can be because you know your story around that bone break. That's the key, is you want to think about the qualities of your life in the before the bone break, the during, as well as the after. So I talk about an energetic and emotional roadmap because this kind of consideration, this phase can feel a lot more subtle. It can feel like I don't quite get it or I can't quite connect to it. But the connection piece is actually when you think about yourself in what I'm saying. Think about how you felt before. So let's just take a really common example. We're talking about breaks. A lot of people break bones generally when they're younger, but obviously, so that's not a hard fact. You could be in an accident, you could trip and fall, you could be doing winter sports, high collision-like sports, all of these things. You can get all sorts of different breaks, obviously. But let's just take a really simple example so we can all get it. Let's imagine that you were like a high-level athlete and you had your whole kind of identity wrapped up in being an athlete of this type. Let's say you're a rugby player. I used to work with rugby. And, rugby was your thing and you had a very forward goal. Maybe you're going to go to university and play rugby for the university team and so on and so forth. And that was really so intertwined with who you were. And you have an injury. You break your arm. You break it all the way through. Let's just say you break both of these bones, your ulna and your radius. And that incident changes it's not just an isolated, like broke my arm, no big deal. Actually, it completely changes the way that you function, the way that you think about yourself, the way, forward in life. All of these things start to change and transform. And so we want to recognize and be really on top of these three roadmaps. What was the feeling, the energy of your life before? What was it during the incident? And then what was it after? This is also very important for stuff like accidents, car accidents, equestrian, like horseback stuff, going on 4x4s, ski-doos, all of these things, these like high, velocity machinery and fun toys, all of these things can be very, when an accident happens, it can be very scary. And it can change the course of your life. Maybe you were a farmer and now you can't farm anymore. This is a big deal. And I'm giving you these kind of like large examples just so you kind of get the picture, but think about it maybe in a more subtle form in yourself. The more subtle form in yourself doesn't mean it's any less important, but you do need to recognize it in yourself. So once you can recognize it, that there's still this kind of stuckness of energy, of emotion, of that whole event in particular, once you recognize that, then you're on the way, you're on the path towards transforming these things. They've been stuck in your body, they've been stuck in the scar, they've been stuck in the bone break since it happened, and this is your way forward to move through that. So really think about that, what you can and can't do anymore, how you feel on the inside, your inner dialogue, your thoughts, your negative kind of patterning, all of this counts. Now let's talk about the what to do. Now, the what to do is the same for everything, and then I'm going to give you what to do for a bone break. So the three-part practice that I ask that you do for every single scar is really simple. The first part is the relaxing into, where you're going to find somewhere comfortable in your home to spend a bit of time. So you are, sitting on the couch, you're in your bedroom, you're in the living room, wherever. You want to be either laying down or sitting. It doesn't matter to me as long as you're comfortable and relaxed. You're making skin to skin contact, hand touching the bone break itself. And you're connecting, you're meaningfully touching the area, meaning you're engaging with it in some way, saying like, I'm about to touch an area that maybe I've neglected or I haven't thought about, or maybe I'm intentionally avoiding because there's a lot of hurt, physically or emotionally in the area. The last thing you want to do is close your eyes so that you can tone down the sense of vision, of sight, and ramp up the sense of touch. It also helps you to just be a little bit more internal and aware of your feeling and what's going on. Then the second part is the physical. You want to gather as much physical information as you can about the area. What does it feel like to the touch? And really go into it. It's more than just a bump. Where do you feel numbness? Where do you feel hypersensitivity? Is it hot? Is it cold? Is there areas that are raised, areas that are stuck down? Can you feel that your skin is stuck anywhere? Is there tension in the muscle or not? All of these things you want to pay attention to, as well as any sense or feeling of like aversion, getting nauseous. If it was a big injury, like a big impact, it's very common that when you start touching that area, people will get nauseous and lightheaded or dizzy or something like that. So feel that out for yourself. And then the third part is the gathering of all of the emotion and the energy surrounding the area. So using the roadmap that I just highlighted, feel into and really like dive into the before, the during, and the after of the actual bone break itself. Okay, so that's what you're going to do for every single scar, bone breaks included, and just see what's there. The whole goal, like the intention of this practice, is so that you start to recognize what's available for you to work on. Recognizing that maybe you were ignoring the area or you didn't actually realize there was so much in there. You didn't spend any time since the bone break to feel the area. Very common. Once you recognize these things, then you actually have something to do. You have a way forward. You just need to figure out what to do. And so that's what I'm going to give you next. I'm going to give you one thing to do for bone breaks. So please don't, I say this sometimes because it's important to recognize, please don't take this practice out of context. I want you to exclusively do it for bone breaks. Don't start doing it on your scar. Don't start doing it anywhere else. It's done specifically for bone breaks at this time of the progression. Try not to mix and match or chop and change anything. Take it for bone breaks only. So like I was saying at the beginning of this video, we want to really recognize that the way that the body changes is through input, by giving some sort of stimulus. When we can stimulate or give input into an area, the body goes, oh yeah, that's there. I can feel that. What should I do about that? Oh, it feels like there's a lot of like dried old blood. This like feels very common to like push your finger into an area where there's a bone break. You put your finger in there and then you remove your finger and you have like a thumb indent. It was like you're putting your thumb into plasticine or Play-Doh. This is like old, dried up, thick blood that needs to move. So hopefully you got that in your three-part guided practice. But after that, what I want you to do is start to put gentle input into the area so the body can start to change. It can start to reabsorb those things. It can start to move those types of things. And you start to actually break down any excess bone. Now you're going to be like, I don't think that that can happen. And I've worked with people over a period of time where our main intention was to actually move some of that excess bone, and we did it. I'm not saying that you're going to do it exactly from doing this one practice, but there are steps that you can do to start to change how that area feels and how that area is connected to the rest of your body. So super simple. Let's just say I broke right here and I have this like that which I'm talking about in this video, this like extra piece of bone. It's like overgrowth from the overdoing mechanism I spoke about in the beginning. All you're going to do is you're going to start to apply gentle pushing pressure straight down. So you're going to push and let up. You're going to push and let up. And you're going to start to put that stimulus and that input into the area. You're going to do it 20 to 30 times with a light that heads to medium, that heads towards heavy pressure. If you've heard my videos or you watch them regularly, I never tell people to do heavy pressure. I'm always on the light to medium light side of pressure. However, bones, they're dense. They need input. They need to know what's going on. So you need to give them a little bit more oomph. You need to get beyond the muscular layer or the whatever layer, the connective tissue layer that is there, and actually start impacting and pushing into the bone directly. So that's the simple first step to working on the bone break. If you have any questions about any of that or any of the content that's in the video, please feel free to type me a question. Let me know if you have questions or if you've tried it and you need further guidance. Please know I'm always here to help. That's why this Facebook group is here. Thank you for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you next week for some more lives. All right, bye.